A lot of people wonder what is the difference between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And in the black community, a lot of people ask the question, what can the Republican Party do different for the Negro than the Democratic Party? Well, in this video, I'm going to try to explain the direct impact between the difference between a Democratic mayor here in New York and a Republican mayor here in New York. Now, I've lived in New York all my life. I'm 41 years old. And I lived through, as a kid growing up, I lived through the Koch administration and the Dinkins administration. And in those administrations, New York City was pretty much falling apart and it devolved into this cesspool. These two Democratic mayors pretty much let this, and the two Democratic mayors before them, because there were four Democratic mayors all the way from the 60s all the way up to about 1993. And from all their terms, the city continued to fall apart and continued to deteriorate and continue to get worse. Now, people who lived in New York City in the 1960s told me that New York City was a wonderful place, it was a nice place to live, and that slowly but surely, under all these Democratic mayors, the city started to deteriorate. Um, at one time, they couldn't even make their own budget, and people were pretty much leaving the city, going out to the suburbs, and the crime rate when I was a kid, during the late 70s, early 80s, 80s and into the 90s, New York City had pretty much turned into a crime infested cesspool. I mean, you couldn't walk down the street, you couldn't even look out your window out of fear of some dope dealer going to take a shot at you or seeing some type of illegal activity. These guys were so paranoid, so afraid of somebody coming after them that they were literally, you couldn't look out your window, you couldn't go down the street, you always had to look over your shoulder, you always were worried about what was going to happen at any given time. In some parts of New York City, people literally, in some parts of New York City, like Brooklyn, people were cutting their furniture down and keeping stuff away from the window because they were so afraid of shootouts and all sorts of violence going on, stabbing, shootings, and all sorts of craziness going on. I remember myself being 14 years old, riding on a train, and I've told this story in a previous video, with guys snorting rocks right across from me. This was on a number 7 train, I think it was. Guy was snorting crack rocks on a $10 bill. On another train I was riding on, there was a big pile of human waste right outside the doors of an A train I was riding to school on. This is in 1988. This is how bad it was. And I can talk about, bands of kids, things like the Wilding incident with the Central Park jogger, just bands of Negroes just running around, tearing up neighborhoods. This all was under the auspices of your Democratic mayors. And their response to all of this rampant crime was a policy of doing nothing. They just sat there and let the city pretty much destroy itself. And people lived in fear for close to 20 years while these guys just twiddled their thumbs. I mean, New York City around the early 90s was so bad because the homicide rate in New York City was had run past 1,000 mark. I mean, we were talking about 2,200 murders around 1991 or 92, and it was so bad that people were packing up and moving out of New York City. Um, that's how bad it was, because that's how bad things had deteriorated. And before then, back in the 70s, due to their Democratic mayor's incompetence, New York City's property values had plummeted because of their policies where they wanted to raise property tax rates. So people they were abandoning their properties because the property taxes were higher than the value of the actual property itself. This is all due to Democratic policies, and all of these policies were were all used on all because all their funding, all the things that they used to fund, were government programs, welfare programs. Literally, they were not about building an economy or doing things to develop a city into something that had value. Now, in contrast, Rudy Giuliani, when he came in 1993, he had a plan to rebuild New York City. And his plan started with dealing with the crime issue. And he dealt with the crime issue head on by going right after your Pookies and your Ray Rays with the quality of life offenses, things like your open containers of alcohol, things like your possession of narcotics, loitering, small offenses. When they found out, and they usually got the Pookies and the Ray Rays, what happened was these guys had multiple warrants, they had multiple felonies, And that was one of the things he used to keep the streets safe. You see, he understood one concept that your Democratic mayor doesn't understand, is that in order to have investment into your city that builds your economy, you have to have safe streets. And if people are safe, then business can come back to invest. And over time, with this Democrat, with a Republican mayor, Rudy Giuliani, and a Republican governor, George Pataki, New York City started to rebuild. And over the 90s, New York City went from a city nobody wanted to live in to a city everybody wanted to come and be a part of. And under Michael Bloomberg, it got to the point where the rent became too blank high that there were so many people coming here that rents were going through the roof. And this was a city that 35, 40 years ago under the Democrats pretty much had become a cesspool and was unlivable. I mean, people were abandoning property, and the city was selling it for buildings, entire apartment buildings, for $1 back in 1983 under Democratic control. But under Republican control, the rent is too high, and Negro doesn't understand, the difference between the two. And the whole thing is that there was an opportunity for the Negro to do something himself. I mean, but he didn't take advantage of it in the 1980s. He could have had, again, all of that economic power himself, but he didn't take advantage of it. Instead, he decided to go along with Democratic policies and go along with the drug game, and now he has no economic power and no political power. And that's all because he supported the wrong party 98% of the time. I mean, what did David Dinkins do to make New York City better? And Ed Koch do, and Abe Beame, and John Lindsay. Those were the four Democratic mayors from the 60s, from 1960 on. These guys pretty much let New York City fall into a road to ruin, yet Negro continues to support the Democratic Party. I mean, the Republican Party, a lot of people say they hate Rudy Giuliani, but if you look at New York City, and if you look at the state of it and compare it, if you lived in old New York, where you couldn't walk down the street without the fear of a drug dealer or a thug or a drug addict attacking you, or you couldn't even open up a window on a hot day because you feared somebody having a shootout over a light-skinned Shaniqua or some street beef. This is how crazy it was under these Democratic mayors. I mean, the crime rate in New York City homicide rate was so bad that it was literally 2,000 murders back in 1991, 2,200 murders in 1991, many of which remain unsolved unto this day. Yet, Negroes still think the Democratic Party did something for them. I mean, what did the Democratic Party do from the 1960s to today for the Negro? They gave them unsafe streets, a high crime rate, a homicide rate, which is the equal of Iraq and Afghanistan combined. Streets that were so unsafe no one could walk on them. Property values which were less than $1. I mean, entire neighborhoods like Harlem, the South Bronx, they were pretty much uninhabited because of these dope dealers and these gangs. And parts of Manhattan below 96th Street were getting ready to head down that road. People were literally moving out of the city and saying it was the least safe place to live back in the early 90s because of these Democratic mayors and their policies. And their response, it was indifference for almost 30 years. It took the death of a white male tourist, from the Midwest, Brian Watkins, for our first black Democratic mayor to actually take response. Instead, I mean, this man let this city pretty much deteriorate into a war zone, and his response was, now I'm going to do something when a white man dies. And that pretty much was a powerful statement to all those black people who voted for David Dinkins back then, and the Democratic Party. What it was, he was saying that, black lives didn't matter to him. I mean, all these black people, most of these killings were black on black. And his response was to just let these black people continue to kill each other year after year, just like the other Democratic mayors before him. I mean, New York City was a killing field under the Democrats, and it took, about 8 years of 8 years of Rudy Giuliani to clean it up, and another, I think, 12 years of Michael Bloomberg to keep it going to this point. I mean, in order to have investment in a city, you need safe streets, and a lot of Negroes just don't understand what it's like to live in a street where it's unsafe. I lived in these streets here in the South Bronx. I lived in the neighborhood of this South Bronx, and I've seen unsafe streets, and I've seen the difference between Giuliani and a Democratic mayor, and I'm now starting to see, the real difference between these Republican mayors and these Democratic mayors with this return to this De Blasio administration. Under this new Democratic mayor, things are headed right back to the bad old days of New York City. And we were warned by Joe Lhota, the guy who Republican who ran about 2 years ago, that things were going to head that way. And right now, things are headed right back to that dysfunctional paradigm of the old New York, with the shootings, the muggings, um, the mayhem and violence, people just doing whatever they want. Because right now, the homicide rate is up, the shootings are up. I mean, we had, on one of the warmest days of the year, we had 13 shootings in one day. And this is all under the auspices of a Democratic mayor. Yet your Negro still believes in this Democratic Party. And this Democratic Party pretty much has done nothing for this Negro. I mean, when you really think about it, those safe streets, those help your kids be able to go to school. Um, those schools that deal with bullies and thugs, that's also Republicans. They did that for you. Um, and other things that they've done for you, you just don't see. You don't see it until you wind up under a Democratic mayor and his insanity. I mean, I remember being in classes with guys. One day he's here, the next day he's dead. That's how that's life under a Democratic mayor. Being in classrooms where people are just walking around and doing whatever. Um, Schools that are just out of control. Again, bands of kids just roaming around on city streets, nobody asking any questions. Under Giuliani administration, people were cutting hooky. Officers were asking questions. They were catching these kids. They were detaining them, and people were finding a level of accountability. Your city was a lot safer. But under your Democratic mayor, pretty much anything went. People did whatever they wanted. Crime rate was through the roof. I mean, and this is what is starting to return in New York City under this De Blasio administration. I mean, again, I talk about the 13 shootings that happened in one day. Another, just last weekend, band of kids were running around mugging tourists, and this De Blasio is just sitting around twiddling his thumbs. But this is what Democratic mayors do until a white male dies. Again, the whole thing is that under these Democrats, they don't understand how things work. They don't understand that in order to have the tourism, in order to have the business investment, in order to have the economic growth, you need a safe city. You need to have a strong police force that protects the city and keeps the criminals from destroying everything. That's how you can get the investment, because no businessman is going to invest their money into a city where the crime rate is through the roof, where their workers aren't going to be safe, where their assets aren't going to be safe. They're not going to invest their money into a city where um, they can't they can't invest anything. I mean, all of this economic growth was due to Republican mayors and all these neighborhoods coming back, like your Williamsburg, your Bed-Stuy, your Harlem, and other areas, is due to these Republican mayors destroying this crime rate. It all started with Rudy Giuliani going after this crime and going after these dope dealers and these gangs and these thugs. And all of this is something that, again, your Negro, doesn't understand was done to help him. And all he had to do was just roll up his sleeves and go to work. Now he could have went back to work way back in the 80s, building his own neighborhoods. But he doesn't want to do the work because he's been brainwashed by this Democratic Party to believe that He's been brainwashed by this Democratic Party to believe that they are acting in his best interest, when you can just look out a window, like I do every day. I just look out a window, and I see, what they bring to people, and all they bring to the black community is crime, drugs, unemployment, poverty, and the only people making the money off the Negro are the liberals' two friends, the pro-black Afro-centric and this Negro pastor. Now, again, the tools are right there for the Negro to build his own community up, and he just never uses them. I mean, I remember, again, in New York, go back to that same discussion where they were selling buildings for $1. Negro just, instead of trying to get things together to buy some of these brownstone shells and this other property that was out here that was being abandoned by people because of the dysfunction of the 70s. No, what they were doing was going out buying themselves Cadillacs, um, And people who were living, having good jobs in civil service and transit, they were going to go live and stay in the projects, talking about living ghetto fabulous. This is the way the Negro thought. And instead of thinking about, building and expanding, they just thought about staying in the same place. And this is where the Democratic Party takes the Negro into that same ghetto mentality and that same poverty way of thinking. And the Negro never grows. And he doesn't understand, that under your Democrats, your cities like New York turn into cesspools. And I can see the cesspool transformation starting right now. And a lot of people just don't understand what's about to happen in this de Blasio administration. I mean, we're 2 years into it, and I can honestly see this thing starting, the hairline fractures forming. And they're clearly forming because I see the murder rate up, the homicide rate up, and his apathy and indifference to these situations. And he's already demoralized the police department, and things are headed on a bad road. But because everybody's, you know, comfortable, they're not seeing how things are going to just turn back. The clock is getting ready to turn back on them. People right now are complaining that the rent is too blank high, but when you have a crime rate that's through the roof, you have people abandoning properties and moving to other areas. That's something that people just don't think about, and they just don't understand how bad it is because you have to live in an area over a period of time like I have. I've lived in the city for 41, going on 42 years, so I understand, where the city is going, and which party pretty much made it livable and which party made it unlivable. Now that's all I have to say for this video. I'm hoping you got an understanding of what the difference between a Democratic mayor or Republican mayor does, and I'm hoping that it really gives you a perspective on which party you really should be voting for. Because Democratic Party, if you really look at their policies, they have not done anything to help the Negro or his community in the last 40 years. And if you continue to vote for these guys, you're going to continue to get the same amount of nothing that you got before. And just sometimes you just have to look at the other side or just look at other parties. I even urge you to go look at independents because Democratic Party as it stands has pretty much done nothing. And I see this slide getting ready to happen here in New York under this de Blasio administration. I've seen this slide happening in many other cities run by Democrats. And you really have to really think that, the definition of insanity is doing the exact same thing and expecting a different result and voting for the same party 98% of the time and expecting change has to be some sort of crazy. Again, that's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.